I'll just introduce myself as we get that set up. So my name is Carl. I work for Schibsted, which is the Scandinavia's biggest collection of media houses, really, where I'm responsible for the subscription newspapers. So that means the newspapers that have subscriptions as their primary revenue source. So we have Aftenposten that I will speak mainly about today. We have some regional newspapers. We have smaller local newspapers on the west coast of Norway. Sorry, and we have some of the biggest subscription newspapers in Sweden. So I will spend some time talking about those. Just one second. It's been a long day for me in Norway already, so I'm going to try to keep my energy levels up here and keep my voice. So what will we be talking about today? It's going to be just, I'll just give a bit of background before I get into the slides here. So first thing is, I've been working a lot on what we call product strategy in my domain. So what is product strategy? I'm going to get into the details of that, but it really is about figuring out what are the important problems that we should be looking at in order to make our product better. So all of us, even though we say our product is news, there's many ways of creating, distributing, and serving news to users in ways that really solve their problems and really nail the user issue itself. There's an information need there. But there's also different contexts and different modes in which you come to us, and we need to be much better at serving those users in a way that respects their time, that helps them understand the world in a format that is compatible with their level of insight and knowledge with the topics that we cover. So it's not enough to just write great journalism. We have to figure out how we distribute that journalism and how we communicate those stories in ways that are compatible with the user needs. And that's essentially what a product strategy is all about. It's about identifying what are those problems that our users are facing, how can we address those problems in the best possible way. So I'll talk a bit conceptually about how product strategy really helps you define those things. And I think any organization, no matter how small you are, should have a product strategy. It doesn't mean you need to have a large product and tech organization. It doesn't mean you need to have 10 designers and a huge organization. It really is about the human side of things, about understanding, well, the users that are coming to us on a regular basis, what are they looking for? What are the issues that they are trying to solve, and how can we help address those in the best possible way? So product strategy will be an introductory topic, and then we'll get into a case study, which is about how did we work in Aftenposten when we created a new front page. And I'm sure most of you have front pages, whether that's a print front page or a digital front page. I assume most of you have a digital edition as well. And we'll talk a little bit about how we reflected on, well, what's the job that the front page is doing for the users? Who are we trying to serve with that front page? And how do we really solve the user problems that the users have when they come to us in the best possible way? So I think that will be a useful case study for all of you. And I think we'll do this in a way where you can ask questions as we go along. I find that they're most useful when asked in context. So we will get right into it. So just raise your hand or turn on your microphone when you have a question. So let's see here. So a few words about me. I work with product in Aftenposten, like I said, and as a product director, I'm responsible for a few different teams that have a combination of product manager, engineering manager, and a UX designer typically. And UX means user experience or design. So we think of that as a sort of an essential part of basically building a digital service. Is you need to have all of those present. So I'm responsible for the product side of things there. That means I help build teams across all these different brands, and I'm also involved in setting the strategy in the newsroom. So in the management team of Aftenposten, we have people representing the commercial side. It's what we call consumer business, which is basically the the subscription side of things. Then we have representatives from advertising, and we have the different editors, and then there's me, responsible for the digital user experience. And just a few words about Aftenposten. It's an old newspaper. We have a long legacy in Norway. It's founded in 1860, so we go way back. So there's both positive things about being an old trusted newspaper. So I think they're mostly positive, but it also means that we have a print legacy, which of course affects the way that we think and act in a digital world. We have a large share of our subscribers now converted to being digital subscribers. And this is where Schibsted has been a real pioneer. By now, this number has gone up a little bit. We're at 150,000 digital subscribers now. So we've succeeded in converting this mainly print subscription base to now being mainly digital subscribers. We've turned our revenue model on its head as well. We used to have 80% advertising revenue to now having 80% subscription revenue. That means that we can work in a whole different way as well. If you are catering to advertisers and your business model depends on getting as much eyeballs and as much attention on the content that you're serving from as many users as possible, that means you optimize for slightly different goals than if you are trying to optimize for long-term loyalty among subscribers. So we find that really motivating, that we can focus on creating a product that really solves a user need rather than trying to solve the need for an advertiser to get as much attention as possible. So we think it's a good position to be in, and we've now been in the game of selling digital subscription to news since 2013, and back then that was a shock to users as well. I mean, they were used to getting all this stuff for free, and we used to think about this as, digital distribution is free, so we might as well give it away there. And of course, that affects the willingness to pay for the print edition. So we changed all that, and now we're in a pretty good spot where we can say that we are digitally sustainable. So if we were to cut our print production today entirely, we would still be profitable as a company. So I think that's a real milestone for us, and says a lot about kind of what we've achieved in the digital domain. We're also fortunate in the way that we operate in markets that are very mature. So if you look at this map here, it shows you the share of people that have paid for online news in the last year. So 45% of Norwegians have paid for online news in the last year. So that's an incredibly large share. You see Sweden is right behind 30%. But looking at other countries, you can see that we do operate in a market where things are possible here that might be very hard to do in other countries. But I think it might be also an indicator of where we are moving. Everything is going towards subscription models. People are used to paying for digital goods, and that's something we should take seriously and be optimistic about. Now, if you look at the product team specifically, I mentioned earlier that the product team in Aftenposten is comprised of tech engineers, product managers, and designers. And what we focused on is what I described in this mission here. We focus on not just creating a sense of urgency or getting as many users as possible to click as many articles as possible. We focus on explaining the news through what we think needs to be world-class digital experiences. After all, we are competing against some of the most engaging digital services out there for that same time. And we need to focus on subscribers. That's why we said subscribers here. When we give context, overview, and a sense of time well spent. And when we say time well spent, what we mean is we are not necessarily trying to get you to spend as much time as possible. We're trying to get you to see the time that you spend with us as so valuable that you keep paying the subscription every month. All right, all good so far. I don't see any questions here so far, but let me know if there's things that come up. Now I'll talk a little bit about product strategy, like I said, and this is a key point for me, where what is a strategy in its essence, and there's a few elements here that I think are important. So here says the purpose of strategy is to offer a potentially achievable way of overcoming a key challenge. So there's two things here. So potentially means you cannot create a strategy with full certainty. It's possible that you're wrong about your strategy. So there's a real need for exploring whether you are right about the way that you've designed your strategy. And then it is about overcoming a key challenge. And you have to be clear about what that key challenge is. And that key challenge can't be just, well, we want to grow our number of subscribers, or we want our readers to come to us more frequently. You have to ask yourself, well, what is the reason why people aren't coming to us more frequently? What is the reason why people aren't reading us more often? What is the reason why we don't have a larger flow of traffic to our sites? That's where strategy gets interesting. And a lot of strategies look something like this, where you say, well, we have some goals, we want to have X number of subscribers, or we want to have a certain number of visitors every day, or we want to have an advertising revenue that looks something like this. And then you have some tactics to get there. So many companies will say, well, we're going to introduce a new format, or we're gonna introduce story-like Instagram-inspired experiences on our site to increase engagement. And those are tactics, right? And then you have some companies that will, you'll have this type of strategy as well, which will essentially describe the business model. So it will talk about, well, these are our main revenues, and we're gonna focus on increasing those. But I would argue that it should be described as something like this. So you have the goals, or the challenges that you need to solve. Then you have a set of strategies. Well, how do we think we can solve those challenges? And then you have a set of tactics. So these are the tactics that we'll employ in order to solve that problem in the best possible way. And this is essentially product thinking, right? This is where you have to look at, well, what are the challenges for the user? What are the challenges for our business? What are the ways and the hypotheses we have for how we might solve that? And what are the things that we will do practically right now, like this quarter? What are the things that we will do in order to address and really deliver on those strategies? So like I said, you have to start out by saying, well, what's the biggest challenge to solve? Then you have to have a set of strategies that you think will solve that challenge. And then there's a few actions where you get really specific about, these are the tactics. This is what we will do this month or next month. And I'll get back to this picture a little bit later. But I think if we start with this concept of like the diagnosis, so many people who hear people that work with products talk, they say, well, you're always talking about problems, very problem oriented. Well, that's because there's always some challenge that you have to overcome. There's always a reason why not more people are using your product. There's always a reason why people aren't coming to you more frequently. And there's always ways that you can try to solve the job to be done for the user in a better way. So this is where you need to, I think if you heard Lena Beate talk about this, you would hear a lot about sort of empathizing with the user and really getting into the details there, both on the qualitative side, so talking to users that are using you today, but also talking to users that are not using your product. Why is that? What is it that you are not solving for those users? And then looking at the quantitative side of things, and I'll show you that in an example later on, how we used quantitative data to understand what product to build. But you have to understand that market, and then based on that, set your diagnosis. So I'm just going to do an example here. This is how I describe the most important challenges for Aftenposten in 2022. And this is from our strategy. So this is not a fictional case. So here you see the first problem. So we see that a lot of our users are not active right after they become subscribers. So we need to help create compelling reasons for them to come back on a daily basis. So if you look at our total subscriber base, 50 to 60% of our new subscribers, they visit us less than once a day on average. So as a result, we have this high churn and we have a low frequency. So users come to us very infrequently, even though they've started paying for a subscription. Second thing is that we serve a one-size-fits-all solution to users. You might say, well, that's the point. That's why I'm subscribing, because I want to know what Aftenposten thinks is important. But there's a real sort of profound misunderstanding in the way that we think about that, because if users truly are different in the way that they interact with the product, then that is the reason why people will also have a different experience of what the product is like. If it's not tailored to you in any way, if we don't help you catch up on just the most important stories, or if we don't tell you, if you've been away for a couple of days, that, hey, these are the stories that you've missed from the past few days, then we're not really solving the problem that we are here to solve, which is helping people understand the world. So we think we need to more actively tailor the product and really help users get the most out of their subscription. Then we also know that since we come from a print legacy where we had to fill the print paper, we produce a lot of articles, and they're quite standardized articles in terms of formats. And there's not that much snackable news. So news that you can consume while you're on the go. There's not that many, we don't have a broad audio coverage either. So we have one daily podcast. We have a few more sort of in-depth podcasts, but we don't make our journalism available more broadly as audio products. That's one thing about our legacy. The other thing about our legacy is that we organize ourselves more based on sort of how we have, we organize our content based on how the actual organization is created. And we base it on our print sections rather than on the user needs. So we think, for example, if we want to cover the war in Ukraine, we need to do that in a way that reflects how users think about that story, rather than how we have organized into opinion section, into politics, into foreign affairs. So you'll find that content distributed across all those different sections on our site, but it all belongs to one and the same story. And from a user perspective, it's the story that matters. That's how I want to be guided through that, through understanding what's going on. So we see that print legacy affects us in more ways than that we're just distributing our content there. It really affects the way that we organize our journalism. Now, we also know that we have quite a large share of manual curation on the front page, and that might seem like no surprise to many of you. I'm sure many of you have a fully manual front page, but we know already from our experimentation that our front page performs better when we let the algorithm do part of that job. So we're not talking about fully automating the front page, but after you've seen the editorially selected top 5 stories, and after you've seen the summary of the day and those types of things, we need to help you find the content that you've missed. We need to help you find content that others have read that you haven't read yet, or we need to help you find those in-depth articles about travel that we know that you're interested in, but you haven't read yet. And those types of things are important. And we know that when we do that, when we let technology do part of that job, then we see that subscribers also engage more. So that's our description of sort of the challenges to solve for Aftenposten. Now, the next step is, of course, to say, well, what are what are the potential strategies that we have for addressing those challenges? So what we call kind of the guiding policy. Now, I'll give one example here of what we defined in Aftenposten based on those challenges. So I like this format as well. This is inspired by a Netflix example that I'll share with you as well. But here we say, let's do the first one here, relevant for you. So what is our ambition? Well, I subscribe to Aftenposten because I always find something I'm interested in. So that's our ambition level. We want to be at that point where you can always find that, and we think that requires us to show you stuff that feels relevant to you as a user. This means that we have to use active and passive personalization for users, and it also says something about the dependencies that we have. Like, how do we get there? What are the blockers that will prevent us from getting there? That might be about your resources, it might be a way that you're organized, it might be about the limitations in your technology, but having a clear idea of what are the blockers from you reaching that ambition is really important when you're formulating that strategy. Second thing is, when you look at what I just said about snackable formats, we currently offer mainly just long articles. We know that many people are on the go, and we want to reach this ambition. I can grasp the essence of a story within seconds. So that's a pretty hairy goal. It requires us to serve different formats. It requires us to produce journalism in a different way. And some of the blockers are, for example, we need dedicated newsroom resources to do it. We might need a whole new workflow for most journalists so that we can tell users the essence of a story. And I'll show you some of these examples from how we worked on the front page. We also have a strong position on audio, and we want to enable users to always listen to your favorite podcast and audio articles. So that means we are making all our articles available for listening. And you might have heard of this concept of sort of the unread guilt factor. You know, you're subscribing to a newspaper. If you have a print subscription, you see that it just piles up, and you should have read all those articles, but you didn't. And we think that audio can play a key role in helping users get through that content, because they can now listen to that content while they're gardening or while they're on the bus or wherever. So we think that that can really unlock a different type of attention. So that's one goal. It's about formats. And the last one is what I referred to earlier, navigation based on the user needs. So how can we help users explore and understand complex stories? I like to think of this as an iceberg. So what the front page should show you is the tip of the iceberg. Those are the most important stories that we need you to read. If you're just going to read a couple of articles, then read those. That's the tip of the iceberg. But then how do we, if you are interested, if you have more time, how do we enable you to dive deeper? And that's a navigation problem, right? We need to help users dive deeper when they have time to do that, but then stay at the surface when they don't have time to do that. And that's where smart and efficient formats come in. So now I'm just in snacking mode. Later on, I might be in the mode for going deeper into stories. How do we enable you to navigate the bigger story? So we've explored a few methods for doing that in how we've organized our Ukraine journalism, for example. So there it is. There's summed up. There's our product mission. That's what we're trying to do as a team. These are the strategies that we will employ to get there. And then there's different parts of the product that we will affect in order to get there. And I'll focus today on the front page specifically. How did we try to deliver on some of these ambitions on the front page? But then this just shows that our portfolio of products and channels that we have for reaching our users are many, and we have to take responsibility for all of them. Now, the last part of the strategy here is really getting specific about, well, what are the tactics that we'll employ and when will we do those things? And that's sort of when you see companies talk about a roadmap. So roadmap sometimes is seen as a very negative thing because it implies that you work in a very sort of waterfall, non-flexible way where you just define the course that you will run on, and that's kind of just given, and you have no flexibility. So in product or in tech development for the past few years, people talk a lot about that flexibility, about being lean and being agile in the way that you organize your work. And I think roadmap really serves the purpose of making sure that the organization understands the direction that you're going in and kind of the timeline that you're working on, but they are not firm commitments to when you will be done with stuff, for example. That's hard to say, but what you can say something about is, we're doing this now. Next, we think we'll be doing this. And it also shows the organization, what are all those tactics that you're working on, and how did they materialize? So here's one example from Netflix, right? So Netflix wants to work on personalization as a strategy, and they have one algorithm that they want to test in Q2, and in Q3 they want to work on voice recognition and then language detection. And these are not necessarily firm commitments, but it shows you something about, when are you likely to see some of these things? If you're a stakeholder in the organization, then when are you likely to see some of these things in production? Working with interactive storytelling, voice activated decisions. So that's part of the strategy, right? Is to say, well, we believe interactive storytelling will be a key driver to success for Netflix. So we're going to do this thing in Q2, for example. Now there's pros and cons of having this format. I've seen another format as well that I found pretty interesting, where you really focus on the outcome. So in this case, you'll recognize this from the Aftenposten example. You say, well, I watch Netflix because I find content I want to watch, or I find content I can't get anywhere else. So this is really the strategy around original content. And then you have some ways of measuring, are you making progress toward that goal of delivering on that strategy? And that's, I think, a key reflection here, is that a strategy can be a set of strategies. It's not necessarily just one thing. You are making several bets. Some of them might work, some of them might not work. In this type of roadmap, there are some strategies that Netflix will be certain about, and then there's some that they will be less certain about. And there's leading indicators that will tell you, are you moving closer to your goal? And it's key to have those leading indicators or KPIs or metrics in place so that you understand whether it's worth pursuing it. So if we're not seeing a movement in any of these leading indicators, then maybe we should scrap that strategy. Maybe we should remove it from the roadmap. Here's a version of it done for Aftenposten. So I told you about the product strategies that I mentioned, the reasons why we think those are important. Here are some of the ways that we are measuring these things. So for example, audio increases user value. We measure the percentage of subscribers who listen to our content in the product. Then we have another one, percentage difference in listener engagement. And that refers to our text-to-speech functionality that I presented in the IPI event in Vienna. That was one example of that, where we are creating a synthetic voice that enables you to listen to any article. And we want to understand how good is that quality. So that's one of the projects that we're involved in right now, is we have created a voice that we think has an impressive ability to read out articles and make it sound like a real human. And what we're doing then is to run an A/B test. I'm sure many of you are familiar with A/B tests, but what it means is just that we run two different experiments in parallel. So one set of users will get the version of the article that is recorded by a human being. The other 50% will get the version of the article that is essentially read out loud by the robot voice. Then we measure the difference, like how long did they listen in each one of those two groups? What's the completion rate? What's the sort of the initial drop-off rate? What is the click-through rates? All those things will be things that we measure. So that's just an example of, so for what we're working on right now, those are the tactics that we're employing. And then next, what we're pursuing then is to look, for example, as playlists and queues. So we think if we're going to nail the user mode here, we need to not just add a play button to an article. We need to queue a narrated article once you're done listening to today's daily podcast, for example. So that's something we're going to explore next. And this doesn't make a hard commitment to saying that will be done by June. It just says that after we're done with that first thing, then we'll do the next thing. That's why I like this sort of light touch roadmap, is that it says something about what you think will happen. It doesn't make a firm commitment. And it also says something about, well, we're considering these things. We're not sure. We might be just exploring those things. And yeah, you might have heard about the term product discovery, and you might be in that phase for those things in the far right column. So you're saying, well, we're exploring whether these things are worth working on. We don't know that yet. So it's just an example of, if you are working on a few different projects in your news organization, and you're making a few different bets, this is a good way of visualizing how do they fit in? How do we know if it's worth doing? And if you can't put a leading indicator in this column, if you don't have a way of measuring whether that's worth working on, then you need to have some other really qualitative way of understanding, is it worth working on? Because otherwise you'll just work on strategies for a long time without knowing whether those are the right strategies. So I think that's kind of a good summary and a good bridge to what we did in Aftenposten when we built what we called a front page for time well spent. Are there any questions before I get into that? I'm just going to check the chat here quickly. No questions so far. Perfect. I will keep going. All right, so let's first start out with a challenge. You'll recognize the recipe that I presented earlier for how I think about products. So there's always a challenge to be solved. No matter if the world looks pretty bright and sunny, there's always a challenge to be solved. So in the case of Aftenposten, we saw that our subscription growth was stagnating. So we had a relatively rapid increase in the number of digital subscribers. Then it started stagnating. So we interviewed a lot of users. We hired an external agency for doing this, and they ranked our user experience pretty poorly, right? So you'll see all these indicators of user experience. They were not ranked very high versus other competitors. But it was also clear that we could really build on some of these associations here. So gives new insight, explains why things happen, all those things that we thought, well, here's something to build on. And based on all these insights, we set a new direction for Aftenposten, where we wanted to just essentially be best at explaining the news. So we call it the explanatory news experience. So it means we give users a quick and efficient overview. We tailor the product to users' habits. We also help users understand what's important. So it can't be just a flat hierarchy. It has to be very clear. Well, what are the most important stories? We publish a lot of stories every day. What are the most important ones to read? And we have to help users understand contexts, and it has to be done efficiently and quickly, right? You're on the front page for maybe just a few seconds. So how do we help users understand context at that point in time? And then importantly, we can't just tell you about the sort of the hard news stories in the world. We have to be a source of inspiration. We have to have a mix of content that will inspire you, that will introduce new thoughts and new ideas. So there's a balance to be struck here. Now, talking a little bit about our process, and I'm sure to many of you, you might have completely different setups. I'm sure many of you have much smaller organizations than this, but I think the principles here make a lot of sense. I'm sure in most media houses, you'll have someone who works with a digital experience, then you'll have one team that works, or maybe one person even that works with the commercial side of things, and then someone who's responsible for the editorial decisions. And I think, if you look at it in a very sort of basic way, you can say that journalists are responsible for deciding which stories to cover and prioritize those stories. Product and technology, if you have that, or if you have a digital team in some way, they'll be focused on kind of how you present and distribute and package those stories. And then you have a consumer business or sales organization, or maybe some combination of responsibilities here that will be focused on the sales and growth and the customer experience as you go from being an unidentified user or a flyby user to maybe potentially becoming a subscriber if you have a subscription service. Point here is that, yes, we have these specializations, but at the end of the day, the user experience happens at the overlap of all those things. So as a user, this is a service to me, right? I'm paying for a service, and that service is understanding what's going on in the world, or it's about getting new insights, or it's about those drivers that I just showed you. It's not really about, well, I'm just getting the journalism, or I'm just getting the price. It is the combination of all those things. And that's why we need to also think about those things holistically. So we need to collaborate when we think about these questions. So which users should we focus on? Like, who are the target users for our product? I mean, one thing is who are the current users, but who could be using our product? If we priced it differently, could we be relevant for other users? If we wrote different types of content, could we be relevant for other users? I mean, what's the potential in coverage of the startup industry in Oslo, for example? Is there something we could do there to be more relevant to those users? So, and then you have to look at, of course, well, do they have a willingness to pay? Can they afford the subscription at the price point where we operate? Either that you can say, no, we're not going to focus on them, or you can say, we need to create a differentiated product that's offered at the lower price point for those types of users. So really nailing, like, which users do you focus on? That's a key step. Then understanding, well, what are the needs and habits of those users? Because they can be many different ones. And I'm not a big fan of just saying, well, we are for young users, we are for young professionals, or for adults or working professionals. Those needs and habits, they will go across ages, they will go across geographies. You might find that there's users that are 60 years old and users that are 20 years old that have the same needs and the same habits when it comes to news. So just using demographic data for this is not necessarily that useful. Yes, there are certain indicators and certain things that are similar among certain groups, but I think you shouldn't limit yourself to just that. So you have to dig into this and not assume that you know your users perfectly. And then you have to figure out, well, how should we work as an organization to build products that really address the needs of those users, and then find a way of testing and evaluating frequently. And if you've read up on sort of product thinking more generally, of course, you will know about the sort of build, measure, learn cycle of creating new products and services. But I think it's important that every organization that provides journalism, or that tries to sell journalism in some way, they are serving a product to a user at a certain price point. And that means you have to be concerned about these questions, and everyone in an organization should care about those questions. The way that we did it when it came to the front page was we clarified the growth strategy. We made sure that everyone had a shared understanding of the user needs and the behavior in each one of those segments. We had product discovery in these cross-functional teams where people would collaborate across functions that they worked in. And we ran all these demos and workshops to make sure that everyone was informed, they were aligned, they could contribute with ideas. So that was a way of including the whole organization. We had a few different teams that were involved that we set up that owned sort of different domains. I'm not going to get too much into detail here, but it's important to be aware of these different phases. So the first phase was really about, like, who are we trying to serve? Like, which users should we focus on? Before starting to build something, you have to understand, well, who are we building for? Who are we actually serving? And for many organizations, just asking those questions will yield a lot of interesting insights. So who are our users? Basic question, but interesting when you start digging into it. And who are and what are the biggest problems that we should focus on when we try to serve those users in a better way. Now, growth strategy is really about that first part of the question. We defined our target audience as the digital subscribers that we already have a relationship to. And the reason why we say that is because we know that we are selling subscriptions to people that just cancel their subscription right afterwards. There's many of those. So how can we just work to retain those better? And then there's a few segments where we say, well, we're focused especially on parents. Like we produce a lot of content for parents, and we have some initiatives around a finance vertical. So we will focus on those users in addition to the low-hanging fruits, which are the ones that come to us but then end up churning. We asked ourselves, who are these users? We said, let's focus on not just understanding who those users are, but understanding which users really matter. So there's many users that come to us that that might not have an intention of staying. So which ones of them should we focus on? We started dividing up the users in terms of frequency segments because I think this came from a BBC study at some point. I think it was Reuters Institute actually that did kind of a piece of work on this and trying to understand users based on these segments that describe their frequency. So in the bottom right corner, you'll see that we have created these different segments based on how often do they visit the front page. And what we found was interesting, right? Because you see that the daily briefers that have 1 to 3 visits per day, they represent the biggest share of our user base. And then after that, you don't get the news lovers group, you get the casual users. Those are the second largest group, and they visit us on average less than once a day. What's valuable about this is just that it's such an important reality check for the organization as a whole, because everyone assumes that people come to us every hour, or people are obsessed with refreshing our site. That's just not the case, right? Many users will visit much less frequently than that. And that brings up some interesting questions. Now, this gets pretty advanced, but I think it's interesting if you have an insights team that can do this. Of course, that's really valuable. What you're seeing here is we are combining 2 data sets. So one data set is what I just talked about. How often do people visit? So we see that from infrequent user to news lover, those are all the different segments. And then we looked within that, what is the share of users that are now loyal subscribers, so users that have paid more than 3 full price invoices, to users that have their first subscription ever with us. We call that offer new. So they're in this offer phase. It's a heavily discounted price. And if you look at this, some interesting insights emerge. So let's just look at the news lover segment. So these are the hyper engaged users. If you look at that and you look at loyal users and a first or second full price invoice, you see that, well, there's a fair share of loyal users here. You see that there's just as many loyal users in the casual user segment. So the users that visit us less than once a day are just as important to our financial goals and our growth as the ones in this segment. And if you look at the biggest segment here, daily briefer, the ones that visit between 1 to 3 times per day, you'll see that here the majority of users definitely are. So the majority of loyal users are in this segment. So if you're focused on trying to optimize for the users that are most important to you financially, then you should focus on these groups, right? And that's an entirely different way of thinking than what we usually think. We think that super users or news lovers in this case are also the ones that bring us the most revenue. That's just not the case, right? So this is an eye-opener when you start combining these data sets. We also know that if you look at trial subscribers, those are really important. What does it mean to be a trial subscriber? It means that you are trying the subscription at a discounted price. and you're considering paying the full price, but you're for a period of time, maybe it's 1 month, maybe it's 3 months, sometimes 5 weeks for 5 Norwegian crowns, for example, is something we tend to offer. It's really important what happens in those 5 weeks, right? And what we see is that, you know, more than half, or 60 to 70% of those trial subscribers, they visit less than once a day on average. And why is that important? Well, it's important because this group of users, the trial subscribers, they represent 25% of the subscriber base at any point in time. So it's a large share of our subscriber base. And secondly, if you're going to grow, well, what's the main way that we grow? Well, the main way that we grow is by retaining the users that have just started subscribing, right? So if we care about growth, we really have to care about those users that visit us less than once per day, because those are, after all, the majority. So we have to build better products for these users. And that's a key insight, right? Even if you look on average, right? So I prefer looking at segments like you just saw there, but even if you look at the average subscribers, we see that they visit just once or twice per day on average, and they read about 4 articles daily. This is a really small amount. I mean, we produce 80 articles per day, and the average subscriber reads 4. So it's pretty striking to see this stuff. And even, you know, even our most loyal users, they have relatively low front page frequency. The problem is that the way that we design our product, or the way that we prioritize our content, we seem to sort of assume that people have seen everything that's going on in the world by the time they visit us in the afternoon. That's just not the case, right? So if many people visit us just once a day, imagine if you came to the front page, and this is real, by the way, this is a real top of the front page on Aftenposten, and it's a story about basically a person who's had to work from home, and the second one is a cooking article, and then, you know, this is what's going on in the world, right? On the right column here, you see the world is falling apart, and you come to Aftenposten and you see that someone's working from home, and here's a cooking recipe for you. So that might be totally acceptable if it's the 5th or 6th time you're visiting the front page that day, but it's totally off if we're trying to really deliver value to users who visit for the first time in the afternoon. And as you've seen from the data, many users will in fact visit for the first time in the afternoon. So we have this assumption based on lack of understanding of the data that users visit us much more frequently than they actually do. So we try to conclude based from looking at all this data, well, there's some obvious things that we need to do. We need to ensure that the first visit shows our best journalism, not just the most recent news, right? Or not just an article that we think someone should buy a subscription on. We have to ensure that those users who come to us, who might not have that much time, that the content is snackable for them, that it's easy to engage with our journalism. After all, they don't read that many articles. And as a matter of fact, about half of all users who come to the front page, they just scroll the front page, right? They don't click a single article. So we need to think about the ways that we can make that experience better in and of itself. And the last thing is we need to ensure that you feel like, you know, time you spent on the front page was time well spent, even if you don't visit that frequently. So how do we ensure that it's time well spent? Well, at least we have to start by not building a product that requires you to visit 5 times a day to get a good understanding of what's going on in the world. So these were some of the sort of guiding principles. This is where you get to a point where now you actually start having a strategy, right? This is a strategy because it says something about how do we intend on solving the problems that we've identified when we looked at the data. We used qualitative data, we used quantitative data, and got a better understanding of this. And by the way, the data that I just showed you was combined with a lot of user interviews as well. So we did that to try to cover everything. But yeah, these are a set of what you could call them coherent actions. These are the things that we will do in order to try to solve that problem in a better way. So we worked on that, and we worked in cross-functional teams. We try to test ideas in the fastest and cheapest way possible. And then we try to deliver those into the product. So we try to work in a way where we didn't just have one final big delivery. That's the old school way of building products. It's not just one big set of features that you ship. You test out new ideas, and once that work, you just implement them in the product. So that's what we did in the discovery phase. So we built all these different prototypes for exploring different concepts, different ways of solving this problem better for users. So it said, for example, that, well, let's lower the pace on the front page so that, the users that visit us frequently, they can go to the studio of latest news, or they can go to the recommended section to find those articles, and then there can be a main feed, for example. So let's rethink those sections that bring the sections out to the front page as tabs like this. We also tried this news studio, right, where you can get just the latest news on top as a stripe. We also explored different ways of exploring sections. So we know that very few users, speaking of that iceberg of content, right, we know that many users, they typically don't click into a section. This one is about Oslo, the capital of Norway. Let's help users explore that section without needing to click into it. So you can just swipe through it, and you would have a familiar sort of interaction pattern as people see on Instagram. And we tried out new ways of teasing our content. We also explored different ways of helping users get into a different sort of mode, and what we call weekend mode in this case. So a whole bunch of ideas. And the key here is that as long as you're able to test ideas fast, you can test really bad ideas even. You just need to make sure that you have a clear sense of, well, what are the problems that we're trying to solve? What are the ways that we think we might solve them? And how do we measure if we succeed? If you can do that in a really fast way, then you can also fail many times and still make progress. Now, here are some examples of things that we really believed in that didn't really go that well. This is what I mentioned with these different sections. And what we do when we test this is, you see this element here. It asks users, is this useful to you? Is this a feature that you would like to see more of in the product? And by asking those questions directly in the product itself, we get the yes and no answers, and we get kind of what we call here the approval rating. In this case, 55% who said, yes, we would like to see this in the product. Then we also get a text answer after that. So after you click yes or no, we ask why. So we get the qualitative data as well. It's part of that process. So this is, depending on kind of the level of resources that you have available to you, something that you can do. But of course, another way is just kind of showing this to users on the street and asking them, what do you think? More sort of guerrilla testing. But yeah, this was one concept. Another one was this idea, well, can we help users get an overview of the most important stories by doing a sort of newsletter style introduction to the front page, by saying, well, this is what we covered today. So think of it as kind of a newsletter, as an introduction to the front page. And here again, we asked the users, what do you think? Here we saw a relatively high approval rating, 77%. But the most popular one was this one, where we started right on the front page, inspired by Axios, actually, their format of sort of smart brevity, where you can ask, you sort of show right on the front page, what's new, what does it mean, why is it important, why does it matter, where you can really give users more than just the title of the article. You can say, well, here's what happened, and this is why it's important. This is why you should care about the story. That does two things. Either it can help users understand better, well, is this article worth reading for me? And secondly, here's a bit of background so that you can, if you don't have that much time, if you want to read this one later, then you can just read it later and you can have the quick version right now. So that's something we thought we wanted to solve for users, and especially the users that were visiting us less frequently. They really like this concept. So here's where sort of these segments come in pretty handy later on, as we look at not just kind of the breakdown of who visits us at what frequencies, but we also use that same filter when we analyze our tests. So in this case, we could see that, okay, the approval rating among daily briefers was really high, right? There was close to 100% of daily briefers said, this is something I would like to see in the product on a regular basis. And that finding is really powerful because it helps guide us not just toward, should we or should we not do this, but who does this solve a problem for, right? And we already established that the users that are worth solving a problem for are especially these ones, right? So you see it's weighted towards exactly the types of users that we said we should focus on. So we said, let's go ahead. But of course, once you start giving away the story on the front page, you can ask yourself, well, what happens to article clicks, right? What happens to article clicks? And we weren't concerned with just clicks on that particular article. We were concerned with the overall engagement on the front page. After all, we're not trying to get users to necessarily consume that particular article. We're trying to think of the front page as a service overall. So is this a valuable product overall? So we wanted to look at for users who are exposed to these summaries, do they read fewer articles? So this is what we found. We found that they didn't end up reading fewer articles in total. They actually read slightly more articles. If you look especially at daily briefers, we saw that they read slightly more articles when they were exposed to these brief summaries. So this just shows, I think, that we need to keep an eye on these things. We need to also be aware that these are things that the newsroom will be concerned with. But we can measure those things, and we can measure how they affect different groups. So that's what we did in this case. Now, now we get to kind of the delivery phase, which is we've validated some concepts. We know kind of what works and what doesn't. We're not going to be entirely certain ever. So we need to at some point say, well, we know enough now to start going into the delivery phase, where we start implementing some of these features and we start having them in production on a regular basis. So this is kind of where we ended up with the front page. We created what we believe is a clearer selection of the most important stories. We introduced new criteria for how to edit the top of the front page, where we said, well, it shouldn't just contain the latest news. It should always include what are the most important stories of today. That really is a guiding principle for everything that we do now. We also introduced this concept, like I mentioned, a brief summary of what's the story, what's the background, and why is it important, so that you can get value out of the front page right there. You don't necessarily need to click into the article, because what we're offering here is a valuable service that is worth visiting in and of itself. The purpose of the front page isn't just to generate clicks into the article. It is to help the user solve the problem that they came there to solve. And what is that problem? Well, I want to understand the story and why it matters. If I can do that by just reading the summary, well, then great. Let's make that a subscriber exclusive feature. So that's what we're doing with this, right? Showing it only to subscribers. We're also grouping stories in a way that helps you understand how they're connected. So I mentioned earlier, one of the challenges to solve for us is that our stories are spread out between different sections. Some might be in the opinion section, some might be in the foreign affairs section. Here we combine them all in one. So they're all connected to the same story, and we tag these with the same story tag. We can unbundle these stories together, helping users navigate in terms of not sections, but the story itself. We also started exposing users to evergreens or feature articles that they hadn't read already. So this is where we can use technology as well in smart ways. So we know there's a lot of gold here that users still haven't discovered. So let's show users those articles by filtering out the articles that they've already read. Let's also remove articles that you've seen a number of times but still haven't clicked. So we can do those things, and that's a relatively basic technology. Then we also do this, right? I mentioned how users read just a few articles every day. We tend to think that users read a lot of articles. The fact is that they read relatively few out of all the ones that we produce. So with this product, we do a daily roundup. So these are the most important stories of today. If you're gonna just read 4 stories, then these are the 4 stories that you should read. So you can just click into them and you get a brief overview. They're sort of visual, and they have links to other articles. So like I mentioned with the iceberg, this is the tip of the iceberg. These are the 4 tip of the iceberg stories that if you just want to get an overview of the most important stories, read those, and then you can dive deeper if you want to, and we help guide you to those articles that you can read in order to go deeper in those stories. Interesting thing is that we found that this is also very tightly associated with high retention. So users who interact with these elements, they will also typically stay on longer as subscribers, even if they don't click that often. Even if this performs slightly worse in terms of click rates, we see that they're tightly associated with high retention. Here's just a video of kind of the nice final layout. So there's a whole bunch of new blocks, and of course there's a design element here as well, which in terms of giving better overview, we really wanted to focus on creating a sense that I can see everything in this view. I can see the most important stuff. In the past, we would have one main article that would cover pretty much the whole screen, right? And we wouldn't get a sense of, well, hey, I can see, and I have an overview at this point. So we also introduced new editorial principles. I kind of mentioned that already, but they make a big difference as well. So these are just some of them. I'm not going to go through all of them in detail, but it makes a big difference that we have clear principles for what should be shown and what should be included. And it's again this idea that we should have the user in focus rather than us being excited about the last published article. We need to really think about, well, what do our users need to know right now? And if you visited for the first time now, which many will, even in the afternoon, what do you need to know? And that's a different way of thinking. And I think it's powerful to say what is the front page not intended to do. So it shouldn't just be a place where you put all fresh new articles. It shouldn't be just a steady stream of news. You know, some people describe this as the experience that they get is that there's always something new. We don't believe that's the type of product that we should optimize for being. Some products are really focused on creating that sense of urgency, right? It's like, I have to check all the time because there might be something new that has happened in the world. We don't think that's the best way of creating long-term loyalty and willingness to pay for a product. Relatively few cat videos, those types of things. We still want to be focused on, creating a product that has more than just hard news and war stories. It should be other things than that, but it's still a balance to be struck here. I'm not going to spend too much time on the results there. I think it would be interesting to get into some of the questions here, but I think just what we've found so far is there's a relatively positive increase, even before we've seen sort of course, traffic increases as a result of what's going on in Ukraine. But we have seen that all sort of our KPIs have been affected positively, and what we're mostly focused on is, I mentioned click-through rates and those types of things, but what we're mostly focused on is, are we creating a habit among more of our subscribers? Are we getting subscribers to come back more often? And our main goal has been daily active subscribers. Gone from 119 to 125,000. That's positive, of course. But there's other ways of looking at that as well, where I mentioned those segments earlier, and what we've seen is that there's a movement of users, especially away from the least frequent segments. So that's positive, right? We would like users to visit us at least once per day. We've seen a relatively high increase in the share of news lovers. So overall, quite positive results. And I mentioned this idea of these summaries as well. What we see here, and what adds some controversy in the newsroom, is of course that on the individual article, you do see a decrease in the number of clicks on that article. And you can imagine if you worked hard on that article and you see that many users will end up just seeing the summary of that article on the front page, that's of course a disappointment. But if you take the user-centric view, then, well, maybe we have solved the most important part of the problem by giving users that summary. But it is a hard cultural change as well to take that human-centric point of view rather than the article-centric point of view, or the journalist-pointing center view. So in this example, for example, a big piece of investigative journalism, if people just read 5 lines of summary, that's a disappointment. But we do see that overall click rates actually are higher for when we show these summaries on the front page, and it's not like people engage less on average, but this does become a substitute for reading the full article. And you can ask yourself, is that good or bad? Well, I think it's at least important that we keep in mind that users are not always in the right context to be reading a really long piece. And we have to ask ourselves, how will we solve that problem for the user, if not by showing a shorter version of the article, making that available to you. So it's really, again, about staying focused on what does the user need and how can we solve that user need in the best possible way. And of course, we also ask our users, what do you think, sort of in a more qualitative way. But I should add that some people found it really confusing as well. Some people found it overwhelming. There's too much content. So we get all kinds of feedback, but we try to stay focused on finding that balance between the qualitative measures of success and the quantitative measures of success, and really moving from the article and journalist-centric point of view to a more human-centered point of view when building products. So I think I will stop my presentation there. I've been talking a lot, and yeah, I'll be happy to take questions about anything really, from product strategy to front pages specifically, or maybe some of you want to share a challenge that you are working on yourself that we can get into.
Okay, thanks, Carl. That was really interesting. So there's a few questions already in the chat. I wonder if, Mark, you'd you've got a couple of questions. Do you want to ask it live, or shall we take it from the chat?
I can ask it live. It's okay. Yes. I just check. Well, what did I ask? Yeah, Carl, you mentioned that you guys started the subscription part of the site in 2013, if I remember correctly. That was the same version as we see now. I mean, the closing articles, or it was something different, like sending out the exact same version of the newspaper online.
Yeah, so it started out with a very manual front page, right, where we didn't have any automation. So you had a tool typically for placing all the articles on the front page. So it was fully manual, right? Now we've gone into a world where the layout on both desktop and mobile is fully automated. but we still have a tool where the journalists can select, well, these are the top 5 articles today. And that's manual, right? And we have a few other manual positions in the product. And that's important, not just because we want to offer that as part of the value proposition, right? But also because certain elements on the front page aren't there to perform well in terms of click-through rates, right? They are there to help users understand what's going on in the world, regardless of whether they are clicking with or interacting with the product. So a lot has happened since then, but I would say the most important change since we started is that we've introduced this automatic layout, and that we combine that with an algorithm that can rank the content, and then we can tune that as we want. So we can decide how much should we focus on the popularity of an article, how much should we focus on the sales of an article. And what we do right now is that we have a slightly different front page for subscribers and non-subscribers, where the non-subscribers will get a higher share of most selling articles that they haven't seen. So that's an effective mechanism, right? That increases our sales by about 20% by just doing that, right? Showing a different front page to those users and then increasing sales by, you have to look really hard to find any other initiative that would drive up sales by 20%. So it's really powerful stuff when you start doing this.
Yeah, and is the site running on your own CMS?
So we have a Schibsted-wide CMS. So we're part of Schibsted, big media company with sites across Norway and Sweden. So we have a shared CMS, and what I described here and like the algorithmic solutions, it started out typically with one brand, and then now we've scaled it to several other publications. So that's where we're at today. We are running on sort of a shared solution that we use across Schibsted. And in terms of the breakdown between, between our apps and our web version of our product, there's some overlap between them. We have about, if you look at subscriber use specifically, then we have about 85,000 of our subscribers that use us on web, 50,000 in the apps, and then we have about 23,000 using the e-paper. And the e-paper, as you know, of course, is just a PDF version of the print edition.
Okay, then there's a couple of questions from Einut, I hope I've pronounced that correctly, and also from 24Info in Romania, I think it is, and from Sadarupa Bhattacharya, Citizen Matters in India. So the first one is about, what percentage of users are coming from social media platforms? And then Sadarupa's question is about, they're more niche content. They're city-based, solving problems of, living in big cities in India. And she asks, they get more traffic from search and social media. And how important do you think the front page strategy is in this kind of scenario? And are there strategies in particular that could bring more readers to the front page? Because they're not subscription based, right?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of good questions here. Let's see, maybe I should start. Let's see. Did we also mention Mark's question?
Yes, so Mark just asked you directly.
Yeah,
so
that's right.
There's three more questions in here, and then there's one that came in via email, which Melissa, maybe you can drop it here into the chat.
Yeah, so let's start with sort of the breakdown of users on social media versus other channels. So if you look at just traffic generally, we see that about 6% come from Google, about 5% from Facebook. So in terms of traffic, we see that most traffic to articles come from the Aftenposten front page. About 60% of traffic to articles comes from the front page, but only about 40% of article sales come from the front page. That's of course where You know, we see that there's other sources of sales. So about 50% of our sales come from Facebook and Google. And when I say sales, it means that, you know, you're landing on an individual article, and then you're faced with a paywall, and then you convert from there. So that's about kind of the breakdown that we have. So in terms of sales, the front page isn't the most important platform. Other sources are, but in terms of traffic, then the front page is the most important source of traffic. And of course, it also sort of has a role in communicating the brand and what we stand for and our journalistic profile. So there's a lot of those things that come into play there. But one interesting thing there is that we're of course seeing that when we are selling subscriptions not via articles but via other sales channels inside the product, the churn is a lot lower, right? And you can imagine if you're just looking to get access to one particular article, then maybe you buy a subscription and you cancel it right after. But if you've used the product for a while, you've come to the front page and you use that destination for a while, and then you decide to become a subscriber sort of more voluntarily, then that will have, those users will have a higher loyalty. So that's something we are exploring now, finding ways of getting users to discover Aftenposten and getting more traffic into the site, and then having them go from there to actually converting, so that you don't get just a ton of users that churn very fast. I mean, when I say churn, I mean cancel their subscription. So yeah, good questions, but that's kind of what it looks like, and that's kind of why we've focused on the front page. And I think the next question here from Satarupa is kind of related, right? Where search and social media, I think it's a good question. What happens when you are relying on that, and when a lot of users will come to your site directly on the article? Then in a sense, the article is the front page, right? And the article is the way that you can guide users to other stories in that universe. And there's many different approaches to that, where some publications, I'm sure you've seen, will, once you get to the bottom of the article, then as you scroll, the front page just kind of emerges there. That's one approach. The other one is to think about ways of just finding smart ways of showing the right articles at the bottom of that article. So in some cases, well, maybe you're interested in diving deeper into that topic, but in other cases, maybe you're just interested in reading something entirely different. So finding ways of exposing the right content to the users once they have their attention on your site, I think is the key thing. And if you're focused on like, what is the user need, or what is the user trying to do when they come to your site, I guess it really depends on what type of story it is. So I would just experiment with that and see, okay, what results do we get? And we call that recirculation, like how much clicks do you get to like the next suggestion by showing users more from that same story, versus what engagement do we get by just showing users the most popular stories right now, for example, or the most read stories that the user hasn't yet read, if you're able to filter those out. So I think there's many approaches to that, but I would say generally anything can be a front page. It just really depends on where the majority of users are coming, right? So think of if most users come to you on the article, then the article is the place where you need to solve those user problems, right? Ones that I described. There were 4 things that we wanted to solve with the front page of Aftenposten. Then maybe in your case, you need to identify which problems are you trying to solve for the user on that particular article. It's more than just giving them access to that individual article. That's one way of approaching it. Hope that was useful. I've seen you nodding at least, so I think that's positive. Yeah, one question here. Let's see. Yeah, visual content. Yeah, that the resources needed for creating quality visual content exceeds the benefits gained from it. that doesn't increase user value. I think first of all, that's a really important observation, right? And to stay focused on the data there. So to what extent are we getting that return? But there's of course many ways of measuring that. The format that I mentioned that kind of is a daily roundup is one of those examples where it doesn't actually perform as well as other front page elements. So it doesn't compete with, or it competes essentially because it takes up space that could be used for other articles. But what we see is that the performance in terms of click-through rates isn't as high as with other articles. But then when we ran a different type of analysis looking at retention, then we saw that the users who interacted with these elements, they also stayed subscribed a lot longer. So there might be other reasons for keeping those types of formats on the site than just the click-through rates themselves. But I think you'll see the same things with things like audio, right? We're making a big bet on audio right now. Very few users will interact with an audio piece on site. And I think there it gets interesting when you look at the demographics, right? So who are you really exposing that content to? It might not be the generation of users who are expecting that type of content. Like visual storytelling might be better served than other platforms where users are expecting it. And that's, when we've experimented with narrated articles and we add a play button to the article itself, we see that 1 to 2% of users will click that button because they're not in listening mode, and the users will maybe be aged 40 to 60. The ones that click into the article, they're not typically the types of users that are audio addicts in that sense. So I think figuring out where do you serve those things, like video and photo. Yes, you might want to distribute it on your site, but maybe you should think of it as a reach strategy, and that you just distribute that where people expect more visual storytelling, and you think of that as that's just helping build our brand. So it's really about like, what job does that do for you? And might not. I think it's just good that you are staying on top of the data there. And I recognize those that type of experience. So yeah, there was another question here. Top tips for synthesizing audience research data in the context of designing a membership program for a media house with a newsroom. Audience segmentation. Yeah, I'm not sure if I'll be able to provide a good answer to that immediately, but I think there's of course, there's many ways of slicing and dicing that data. So I would just look into especially looking at the goal of the membership program in and of itself. So how much are you spending on that membership program, and to what extent is that a better investment than other things that you could be doing in terms of marketing and other things? So I would try to just really get a good sense of the return on that investment, and then looking into, well, how many users are you actually retaining as a result of that? Most of those membership programs will be about retention. So is it effective? That's where I would start. So I think I have time for running 5 minutes over. If people would like that, it looks like we have 2 more questions.
Yeah, there's one. I think there's one more question there, Carl, from Gulsen.
Yeah.
So yeah, and then we should probably cut the questions. I have just one I'd like to wrap up with, but sure. Yeah.
This is a good question, Gulsen. I would say that it's been surprisingly easy to get journalists on board with these new principles, and the reason why I think we got to that point is because we started out by describing the problem to solve and the challenge that we're trying to address here, and just really helping the newsroom also understand, well, who are we actually serving with our product? And you can't really argue with that data. It's obvious that we are tailoring the product to a different audience than we used to think. And we are, optimize, or we used to anyway, think of our users as way different from how they actually are. So so the feedback has been mostly positive. There's of course parts of the newsroom that see that their journalism is getting less exposure. Like there'll be cultural articles, or there'll be maybe some specific niches that get less exposure, and they'll react to that. But then if you refer back to, well, what's the reason why users are coming to our site, and are we producing a front page that's in line with those expectations and those user needs? And then most journalists in the newsroom will also understand that and agree that yes, we should be focused on the user, and like we should be focused on what problems we're trying to solve for the user and the reason why they're coming to us in the first place. So yeah, start with the data, and then usually it's better to have a conversation about that then, and that can yield interesting results. So I try to say humble in that context and say, well, feel free to challenge the data, and if you think there are other pieces and considerations that should go into this. But then you get a discussion about not the solutions, but the problems that we're trying to solve. They might think that the problem to solve is different. That's why, again, I sound like I'm obsessed with problems, but it is really important that you agree on that diagnosis. So what's the diagnosis? Bring the newsroom into that discussion, bring them in early so that you feel like they're part of that journey, rather than just presenting them with a solution and saying, hey, this is what we built because we think this is the best way. Then you'll get a lot of discussions. So that's it's a lot of storytelling when you're doing these kinds of changes.
Okay, all right, so just to wrap up, Carl, if you don't mind, I thought, like, I mean, the way you started this presentation by telling us that, it really doesn't matter the size of the newsroom, everybody needs a product strategy, because it's really about, it's a human question, right? We need to be thinking about what job is our journalism doing for the communities that it serves, so, and understanding that need. So I wondered, because I think a lot of the people here are coming from smaller newsrooms, how should, I mean, how can you think about that from a small newsroom perspective? Like, how do you put together a team? How do you think about, solving those problems? I think if you could perhaps leave us with some, thoughts on that, that would be great.
Yeah. No, it's a good question, and many journalists and news students will naturally have a curiosity about what their readers are interested in and how to cover those needs in the best possible way. So I would say to just kind of use that engagement as a good starting point. But I think it's partially a hiring question. So when you hire people, do you hire people that have a very traditional toolbox of skills and abilities? Are they able to, for example, record a video and distribute that in some way? Are they? So I think the definition of employees in a newsroom will change, and that we need to also think about that. When even if we're small, we might want to think about hiring someone who has the ability to produce video and who has digital competence. But in terms of thinking like a product manager, that's possible for anyone. It's really a mindset thing, and there's all kinds of resources available out there. But to get started, I would say, if you are having any user interaction, whether if you have some level of customer support, even if that's just a phone number, or if you have an email where things are coming in, can you start putting that stuff into some kind of system? Like how, so you can, the feedback that you're already getting, how are you processing that and adjusting your product? But then what are some really simple ways that you can ask users for input? I mean, can you add an email address at the end of the article and say, hey, we'd like to hear from you. What do you think about today's edition? What do you think about this particular article? And I think just nurturing that curiosity in itself will help you build a better product. Then you can make adjustments. And a lot of the things that I showed you now, they really don't require you to have a big technology team. They just require you to think differently about how you write. So as, for example, if you know that a lot of users will, for example, have a need for getting a brief overview of what the article is about, you know how many people will have several tabs open because they don't get through the whole article. How can you address that in the article in itself? Can you write 3 bullet points at the start of the article saying, well, these are the key facts. If you're just going to read, take away 3 things from this article, here are the 3 things. I think anyone producing any kind of journalism they can do product development just based on how they put together the article. So there are so many of those simple things, and I think the technology here is one part of it. But what I'm seeing, at least from the work that I'm doing, is that most of this is about journalists and how journalists think about producing content and what the users are really looking for. So start there, start small, talk to the people that are using your product, talk to the users that are not using your product and ask why they're not using it. And already there, you can start to get a lot of ideas. So I think that's a good way to get going and to start introducing some product thinking in your organization.
And like you took us really inside your processes, and that's been fascinating. I really liked the roadmap, and I mean the whole way that you explained the processes, but I think particularly the roadmap is a really useful kind of tool. And I wondered if there are any templates or tools you could point us to, that would help us go through that process.
Yeah, I mean, I can share some of the content from this presentation, and I would say if you just get started with basic things like trying to define the reasons why people should come to your site. If you start there, trying to list out those things, trying to keep it relatively short, what are those reasons why they should come to your site? What's unique about your service? I can share some resources with you, Jackie, that you can distribute after this call.